Hey there, folks, and thank you for following up with us for our post-conversation about when does analysis happen. This is an important question that came out of the January 5th, 2022 webinar I did with the IIBA about where does the BA fit into Agile. And a lot of people had questions about that. Susan and I are going to jump in and answer those questions for you in just a moment. I'd also like to take a moment to invite you again to attend the Business Analyst Masterclass I'm teaching this coming Friday, January 14th. It's a great way to take your practice to the next level, whether you're a beginner or an experienced professional. If you're interested in that, go ahead and click pause at this point so you can see how to register. I'm not going to take a lot of time on this. I know most people want to get right to the material that we did from the webinar. Thanks again, and I'll see you soon.
Hi, everybody. It's Ryland, Leyton, and Susan Moore, and we're back after our conversation last week about where does the BA fit in Agile Lifecycle and Agile development. And we've been going over the chat logs and trying to answer a few extra questions. And we think the best one to talk about is where does analysis happen in the Agile Lifecycle? Susan, can I pitch to you for a minute to go ahead and frame that up for us a little bit into what you had seen in the chat log and so forth, because you're paying more attention to that during our hour than I could.
So we had a number of different questions on this theme, everything from please tell me that we're supposed to be doing analysis before the sprint to my team requires me to do analysis in the sprint. And I think it's a really good question because, you know, I've worked in organizations where the team wanted to try to do full analysis and deliver that story within the same sprint. I know a lot of other business analysts have that question out there. So I think we need to give them a little more context because just saying it needs to happen before the sprint, it may not make complete sense to everyone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I would call this one of those beginner Agile mistakes. And it's not about the BA or anybody else. It's just somebody who looks at Agile and starts dealing with Scrum as the process we talked about as a typical thing, as most will know, is that, well, everything happens inside the sprint on a cadence, and they'll expect the analysis work to fit that as well. And that's not quite the idea. The idea is that you create working software on cadence. It's pretty much impossible for anything of any reasonable size in a 2-week, 3-week, or even a 4-week sprint. And y'all know my preference is much more towards a 2-week sprint in general, to pick a thing, analyze it sufficiently to write good user stories on it, and then work those user stories to the point where they are a potentially shippable product inside a 2-week or even a 4-week increment sometimes. And really, if you think about it, okay, what are the developers supposed to do while the analyst is writing the stories? Twiddle their thumbs, do technical debt? It's not the way this is supposed to work. So it's an obvious thought that, hey, that's maybe what's supposed to work, but it's not really how the label is supposed to be applied. The idea is when you walk into a sprint or you're doing your sprint planning, the BA has brought and readily analyzed already before. And we say outside the sprint because it's not sprint work. So it's not something we're tracking in the sprint. They've done their analysis work and they have prepared stories that have been through whatever your definition of ready to estimate is, or ready to play if you're getting to that point. But whatever it is, they are ready for the team to accept into the sprint, to estimate, to make a commitment in the sprint to do, and to believe that they can get this collection of stories that fits their velocity done in that 2, 3, or 4-week increment, whatever it is. You're doing all of your analysis work outside of that. You might need 8 weeks to really analyze a giant epic and break it into pieces that are really ready. You might also need 8 weeks to do that, but some part of it is ready on this 2 weeks. Then you buy yourself the next 2 weeks to do more analysis and more analysis. And that's actually like the virtuous piece of this whole thing. So that's really it. You're doing your work outside the sprint because you should have delivered great work that the team can do. And while they're doing that, you're doing other things. You're getting the next sprint ready. You're kind of radar 2 to 3 sprints in an ideal world, 2 to 3 sprints ahead. But we typically meet 1 to 2 is my experience. Susan, I rambled for a minute there. Do you want to add, edit, or anything else about what I said?
Here's what I'll add to that. I think that the mistake, I'll call it, it's the rookie Agile mistake. So I'll use your terminology there, is that anytime requirements are done before the sprint, that's waterfall. And so I think that some teams, some organizations just can't imagine, well, what does that look like? If requirements before, if that's waterfall, we're doing Agile, we must have to do them in the sprint. I think it's a good question. But really what we're talking about here is not full definition of all the requirements. We're really talking about that just in time. And I know here on the diagram that we're looking at, you've got that concept of a product backlog. So is that the backlog that the BA should be working from to define their requirements?
So the requirements of the backlog are both a little bit separate in the sense of like the backlog could be, remember the product backlog contains, in Agile terms, product backlog items or PBIs. And that can be features, stories, epics, ideas. The thing is that a sprint backlog can only contain user stories which meet our invest criteria. Okay, they meet a definition of ready to play, and they're valuable, they're small, they're testable, all the other things that invest says. Because the team develops software, right? So if you're giving the team who's doing a sprint a user story to do, it's got to meet that definition. But you could be saying there could be a thing in the product backlog that's an idea, right? Just an idea in general that needs a lot of fleshing out, and you're working on that with the product owner or other stakeholders. Or it could be fairly well defined, and you're just getting it ready into stories for the next 2 weeks, for 2 weeks away, right? You gave the team, or you worked with the team to get the sprint backlog done that you're doing right now. You've got 2 weeks before you get the next one. So you're working on that. And, to say you don't do anything in the sprint is, remember, the product owner, the BA, we're all on call for the team, right? Top priority, clear roadblocks for the team. If the team has a question, hey, this requirement looks a little ambiguous. Didn't realize it when I started, but right now I've got a question. Do you mean X or Y? You jump on that and get it resolved. Chances are you just needed to clarify. But if they've raised up something nobody's thought of before, yeah, you might have to declare it means this right now. And if we don't love that, we will play another story to iterate this because you don't want to mess with the sprint that's ongoing. But yeah, it's like you could have a requirement. You need to iterate that. You need to break that into user stories. So that's what you're working on. The team doesn't just do like some abstraction of requirements. They do typically, good practice, they build the thing you've defined as a user story. So how does that fit with your experiences?
I've had two experiences, two really vastly different experiences. My first one was working in an iterative shop where as a BA, I worked on requirements that might be due in a couple of sprints. And at the same time, we had a development team who was working on the work that I had delivered them from, previously, and they were working a couple of, a sprint or two ahead of the QA team. So rather than it looking like we were all of us delivering the same content in a particular sprint, we were each delivering something that was the input for the next guy's sprint, which I think is really kind of what we're talking about here. And that, that's that iterative way of working is what you're proposing here. And I'm imagining that the BA and the product owner is really working between the product backlog and the sprint backlog here. And that might even be a little bit of an iterative process. I'm pulling things out of the backlog. I'm figuring out how to break it down into stories. I'm completing those stories and I'm moving it on, and then I'm coming back. And there could be things coming out of the sprint backlog going into the product backlog that as the BA, I've got to shepherd that through and make sure that I'm doing that. So I think your point is really the important one. The sprint is for the development work. That's the important thing coming out of there. But the other work that the BA and the product owner are working on are really helping to fuel that engine of the sprint.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one other visual that will be really helpful for us. I'm going to just tell our audience so they don't get wondering what's going on. I'm going to pause our screen for a moment in our recording, and then we're going to come back with a different visual. So just 1 second, everybody. All right, welcome back. It's our first experiment, pausing and resuming recording. Hopefully that worked all right. So this slide, it tells a little different story. The other one we're looking at is really just the product backlog and the sprint backlog and getting things done. And of course, in that space, you're just focusing on the sprint. So this diagram I wanted to bring up for a minute from other presentations I've done to say, look, here's all the work that goes around supporting what goes into this. All the rest of the work is to make sure you make the right choices about what to build, right? Because the most expensive thing you can do is build things. The rest of it is, relatively speaking, less expensive. So we build things, we then show them to users and get their feedback, solution assessment and validation, right? What did we expect? Did we get it? How did that go? Let's look at the backlog, where we're then going to take our backlog, we're going to reprioritize and move things around. We're going to take things out, insert things that we didn't know from before. This is all analysis activity, right? This is all analysis activity. We do more analysis to say, what can we put into the sprint, right? What is ready and well enough defined that we can write a quality user story, get it in there for the team and let them run it. And then we keep doing this. And this is all different versus waterfall, where we would start with, what are our requirements? Write all of them, never coming back to them in theory, right? That's the waterfall idea, right? We've now passed the stage, we're never coming back. We're going to build everything, we're going to test everything, we're going to deploy everything, and then it's done. Here, we have a continuous flow of ideation and development and work. Even if we're doing fairly fixed scope things, we're constantly evaluating what we're doing so that we see what should we do next and how should we change what we're looking at doing. And all of that is analysis work. Okay. So I've again gone on just a little bit. Susan, let me turn to you and see what you might think.
I think this is an excellent picture that really emphasizes, first, the things that BAs are accountable for, but I also think it shows the complexity of trying to do those in the same sprint that you're trying to deliver them. These things simply can't happen in the same sprint. You can certainly time box these activities, and you can put a container around it that we do some things that take us 2 weeks. But you need that flexibility, because just like we say Agile is about flexibility in software development, we also mean Agile is flexibility in what we want to pull forward into that backlog. So we have to have an approach that allows us to work with our product owner, stakeholders, anybody else, so that we can find the right mix of things that we should be working on to continue to deliver value. And frankly, that when we come out the other end, that we make sure that we actually delivered it, or that we need to tweak it. So I do think this puts the focus really on the BA, the analysis work that's got to happen.
Right. Well, I think we've covered what we wanted to talk about post-conversation. So I think we're going to probably just stop there and say thanks, everybody. And look forward to talking with everybody again at the IIBA at another webinar during 2022. And your questions were great. And thanks for those of you who attended, and see a lot of you at my workshop this Friday. So we'll have that up again. So both say goodbye. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks, Ryland.
Okay. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks.